The cavernous bowl of the grand convocation chamber hummed with the echo of 1,000 empty seats, their floating platforms suspended like midnight fruit from the vaults above. Shadows lay in blue skeins across the polished floor, and in that hush the air smelled faintly of ozone and recent violence. Lightning had scorched lines across the durasteel rail of the Chancellor's podium. Smoke threaded upward in tired veils. A single green blade burned, low and steady, held in the wrapped, gnarled hands of a being who had outlived empires and watched republics rise and fall like the tides of unseen seas. Yoda exhaled, and the breath left him as if it had to fight through centuries. Across from him, the man who had been the Republic's steward stood with shoulders slightly bent by the weight of hidden armor. Sidious's eyes, those sulphur eyes, gleamed with relish and cold purpose. The ruined lips peeled back. A smile without warmth appeared like a cut in the world. "No more games, Master Yoda," he said softly, as though a parent humoring a child. "The Senate is mine. The war is mine. The Force is yours. Nothing is," Yoda murmured, and his small body leaned forward on his cane-scarred feet, the blade angling, the wisp of green light steady as the pulse of a heart resilient to storms. "Yours, least of all what breathes through all things." Sidious laughed, a dry flick, and his hands blossomed with blue fire. It came howling, a river made of night, spearing toward the old Jedi. The first arc struck, and Yoda lifted his palm, fingers pressed to invisible threads. Energy met him and trembled against him, skittering along the curve of his will. Sparks flew into the gloom, burning brief stars that winked out over the empty seats where worlds' voices had once gathered in faith and argument. The lightning bent, seeking seams in the little master's defense. Yoda gave ground, his feet barely a whisper on the floor. He let the storm wash and rolled with it. Muscles in his arms burned and his bones sang their thin protest. He stepped aside as the next wave blastingly struck, cutting a scar in the marble dais that hissed. "Yield," Sidious crooned. "The age of Jedi ends. The age of order begins." "Order," Yoda said, through clenched teeth, feeling the Force as a great ocean, a rising swell. The lightning hammered again, and this time he took it, not with resistance but acceptance, catching the flood in cupped hands of will. "A cage for the living, your order is." His mind stilled. He remembered a child's warm laugh he had heard on the steps of the temple 100 years ago, the way laughter had sounded the same on every world. He remembered Qui-Gon's patient defiance in council chambers that smelled of incense and old wood, remembered how the young master had believed that the Force was a conversation rather than a law. He heard Qui-Gon's voice now, a murmur like the remembered song of rain over stone. "Master, you must yield to it to shape it." Yoda breathed in. He let the flood enter him, not to drown him but to fill the vessel of his being until light pressed beneath his skin, until the old bones felt like reeds swaying with the pulse of a river far vaster than himself. Tudominus, the ancient discipline, not a shield but a surrender. He drew the blue fire into a hollow he made with his will, and kept his mind as small and as grand as a leaf borne downstream. The energies collided against the well he had opened, shivering, recoiling, searching for edges. Sidious's face contorted from pleasure to concentration to fury. "You think you can hold me, little green worm?" "Hold you," Yoda said quietly. "Hold nothing, I do." He shifted his stance like a dancer pivoting into the final movement, drew the storm into the hollow until the hollow was full, and then he turned his wrist. The green blade snapped upward as if it had been asleep and was now awake. He guided the redirection not outward, not back as a mirror might, but through the wound in the Senate's air itself, a curved ripple in the fabric of the chamber that returned force along a path no eye could see. The lightning twisted. For an instant the space between them was a living knot, blue-white and terrible. It struck Sidious not as reflection but as a collapse. The energy he had cast out folded upon him. It fell into him along the channels he had carved within himself to feed on the dark. His own will made him an open door. There was a sound like a string snapping on some instrument the galaxy had never heard. The Emperor that would be jerked once. his mouth opening on a hissless intake of breath. The sockets of his eyes seemed black, bottomless. The red blade he held sparkled, sputtered, guttered. Yoda moved without thought. He was upon the Sith in a blur of small motion and green light. The staff-quick wrists that had once flicked aside the strikes of 1,000 younglings moved. The green blade crossed and took the red hilt in two. The shards fell. The second cut was not a blade but a press of 2 fingers to the center of a chest. In that small press he moved a stone long out of place. He unseated a knot of life that had been tied to the wrong current. He made no wound. He ended a hoarded breath. Palpatine staggered, eyes widening, features collapsing into a human shock he had not felt in years. He reached out, clutching for purchase, for anger, for anything. He found only the depthless silence of an ocean he had never learned to float upon. He fell forward. His cloak flared and settled. On the floor of the Senate, Sith lightning hissed out of existence. Smoke curled from the edges of torn fabric and from the scorched rings on the polished metal. Yoda's blade hissed closed. He stood watching the body with his head tilted as if listening to a conversation the dead do not keep. He felt no triumph. What he felt was the loosening of a knot in the Force so tight it had choked the breath of worlds, and in its loosening a backlash of pain, a memory of every life perverted by this man's long patience. In that river he could almost see faces. A Jabimi boy holding a rifle too big for him, a child in the temple courtyard running to her master's hand, a woman in a Senate pod praying as fleets burned silent lines in space. He made himself hold them, and then he let them go like leaves. "Done it is," he whispered. The silence was not absolute. The distant hum of Coruscant's traffic fed in through the broken windows. The soft moan of malfunctioning systems drifted from high above where pods hung in arrested motion. Somewhere a guard groaned. Yoda turned and saw one of the red-robed sentinels stirring amid twisted railing. The old Jedi's finger moved. The Force slid like a blind over the room. Sleep found the waking and made them gentle. He crossed to the body. The face, even in death, was a mask. A man too long at war with the world to let it touch him. Yoda knelt. He drew from the sleeve of his robe a small cloth, as if he meant to wipe away the soot from a child's cheek. He touched it to Palpatine's brow, smearing away the last trace of glittering ash. The man beneath was unremarkable. That seemed right. Monsters rarely wore their shapes like banners. "Master Yoda!" The voice, urgent, came from below, amplified by the chamber's geometry until it arrived as a whisper right at his shoulder. "Master, are you? Force, are you alive?" "Senator," Yoda called, and his voice carried without strain. "Come up, you must not. Dangerous. The room still is." A repulsor whine lifted from the floor. Bail Organa's sleek platform rose, the senator from Alderaan standing at its rail, face stiff with horror and relief both. The pallor of his features looked almost blue in the drifting light. He took in the scene with a careful sweep of his eyes and stopped on the crumpled dark. "Is that?" Bail swallowed. "It's true then. It is the end of one man," Yoda said, "and the beginning of many sorrows. Quick, we must be." Bail drew close and lowered the platform until they were almost level. "I've sealed the main doors and diverted the guard, but that won't hold for long. Mon is rallying a few of us at my office. Masameda has already sent a proclamation, claims that a Jedi assassin struck down the Chancellor. He's holding to the narrative he employed after Mace Windu's death. He will turn this into a purge if he can." A shadow crossed Yoda's face that had nothing to do with the lighting. "Truth we must bind to proof. The Senate's eyes, still there are. Records. And more deadly than speech, the orders that turn soldiers upon us." He glanced at the body. Codes he kept. Keys to machines and minds. To find them, we must. Bail's mouth tightened. "I can get you into his office suite. I have a clearance. I served on the Appropriations Committee for the Executive." He offered his hand without theatrics. Yoda took it and stepped onto the platform. As they descended through the great chamber like a leaf falling through stages of night, Yoda let his eyes close just long enough to listen. The force roared and then settled around him. He sought a particular warmth within it, a presence that had come to him in recent weeks like the late light in old gardens. "You did not kill him," said a voice, as patient as spring rain, as stubborn as a seed insisting on green. "He killed himself on the point of his own will. Much to learn, even at my age, I have," Yoda murmured to the air. "Walk with me, Qui-Gon. Walk, until steps are fewer than stars." Bail looked sideways but did not ask. They passed out of the chamber through a subsidiary hall where fallen Senate guard lay sleeping, their pikes clattering as their hands slackened. The lift hummed. The doors slid open on a corridor lined with black marble and framed holos of the Chancellor in happier days, shaking hands and smiling as if the galaxy were already at peace. "Move quickly," Bail said. "My cover story for this lift says I'm bringing medical assistance to the Chancellor's suite." The suite's doors recognized Bail's clearance and folded inward without question. The antechamber looked like money had been taught to sit still. Glossed wood, low lights, the smell of jeweled incense. 2 office droids pivoted toward them, photoreceptors brightening. Yoda made a small gesture with his fingers. Their heads dipped. They returned to their tasks. The inner door's seal lights were red. "You may wish to stand back," Yoda said politely. "Of course." The seal broke with a simple sigh. Inside, the office was a world unto itself. High windows showing dawn vanishing at the planet's edge, the first local morning crawling over a planet that never slept. Shelves of volumes wearing dust as a disguise of humility. Sculptures that were really weights holding down invisible papers. The desk was a curve of night wood. A red matte lamp burned. Against one wall, a discreet bank of machines hummed the thin hum of secrets. "Here," Yoda said softly, going to the machines. They were old. That comforted him. Old things could still pretend to be honest. From beneath the desk he fetched a simple key. The key turned with a click in a lock made to look decorative. A compartment slid open. Inside, 3 data cylinders bound together with a ribbon the color of dried blood, and a second key of unlovely gray. Yoda took them in his small hands and for a heartbeat felt their weight as a sudden exhaustion. So much death at the turn of a hand. "Can you read them?" Bail asked. "Read them, any eyes can," Yoda said, climbing onto the desk with the grace of someone for whom dignity had never been stiff. He slotted the first cylinder. Lines of glyphs sprang up, cold and spare. Notations. Orders. Codes. Yoda's ear frills quivered. "Order 66 authorizations," he murmured. "Branch call verification, dispersion protocols, denial routines. Unmake them, we can." A switch he installed to make soldiers into blades. "Off, we will turn it." Bail leaned in. "Do it." Presence touched the doorway. The Alderaanian's head came up. Before he could reach for his concealed hold-out blaster, Yoda lifted a palm, and the door slid open. Mas Ameda's massive silhouette filled the frame. Horns like midnight towers, robes artfully rumpled, eyes sharpened with anger and calculation. Behind him glided Sly Moore, pale and lustrous as a blade, gaze unreadable. A half-dozen Coruscant guards spread into the room with blaster rifles set at a respectful but pragmatic half-aim. Ameda took in the tableau, the small green Jedi on the desk, Bail Organa perfect in his dishabille of concern, the red glow of the desk lamp spilling its quiet over old wood. His jaw worked once, a heavy chew on his own thoughts. He chose the line he had prepared. "Master Yoda," he said, and even managed a bow that could be interpreted as condescension or courtly greeting. "Senator Organa, this is a crime scene." "Crime, it is," Yoda said without looking up from the display. "A long one. Worn deep the groove of it is. So deep that the cart of your master could roll from one end of the Republic to the other with no steering at all." Ameda ignored the insolence of age. "The Chancellor lies murdered. By the Sith Lord within him," Yoda said. He turned then. His eyes met Ameda's. There was in them no pity and no cruelty. There was only the weight of years and the certain sense of time's tide. "Knew you did." Ameda's eyes flickered. Sly Moore did not blink. Something small moved at the corner of her mouth. The ghost of a smile or its inverse. The guard did not fidget, but their shoulders tightened as if the room had grown colder. "Master Yoda," Ameta said, and now there was steel. "You will surrender your weapon. Senator, step back from the console." "Chancellor's orders you carry?" Yoda inquired mildly. "The Chancellor is dead," Ameta said. "Then whose will do you serve, Order 66 remains in effect," Ameta said. "By Emergency Powers Act 149, all Jedi are to be apprehended pending tribunal. By Executive Security Directive, Order 65, Bail cut in, his voice a diplomat's knife. If the Chancellor is deemed unfit or has acted against the good of the Republic, the Grand Army takes its orders from the Senate. The Chancellor is not merely dead, Moss. He was a Sith Lord. The Republic has been under occupation in all but name. The Senate must now reclaim authority." "The Senate," Ameta said dryly, "will do as it is told, Senator." Slymore took one step forward. "The public will not accept that the Jedi assassinated the man who saved them from war." "Saved?" Yoda asked, and there was in the lift of his brow something like weary amusement. "Say the sun rose because you held a candle, you might." He laid 2 fingers to the console. It was not a Force trick that followed, but a technical one with the Force threaded through it. He moved code as a musician moves notes, not because he had studied the instrument, but because music had always lived in his hands. The screen's red lines unknit themselves with reluctant grace. Then, with the same matter-of-fact motion with which he would have closed a window against a persistent rain, Yoda sent a signal into the net of the Grand Army. A stand-down keyed to the authorizations in Palpatine's cylinders, carrying the unmistakable imprint of the man who had issued 66. It went everywhere at once. To cruisers hanging sleek over a dozen worlds, to field units slogging through jungle dark with the heat of their own breath, to starfighters with helmets bobbing in the light of screens, to quiet barracks where clones were cleaning boots still wet with mud and blood. On the battle-scarred bridge of a Venator over Felucia, a commander's helmeted head snapped up. His gloved finger hovered over a control. "Sir?" a pilot asked, bewildered. On Utapau's high sinkhole rims, Cody's men looked at one another and at their slain memory of a bearded general falling through smoke. The order to continue hunting blinked red to yellow to gray. In the desolate void above Mandalore, an old soldier in battered blue stared as the characters resolved. Rex's jaw worked behind his helmet. "Stand down," he said softly. "Stand down." Across the galaxy, the killing slowed as if a hand had pressed against a blade. Some units obeyed at once, the chip's compulsion shorting against the contradiction of authority. Other units hesitated, then moved with the habit of soldiers whose lives had been written by orders since they were old enough to speak their names. A stubborn few ignored the command, insulated by altered protocols, or bounded to a narrower chain that would only accept a voice that was gone.
Mas Ameda's nostrios flared.
"What have you done?" "Stopped a thing from being worse," Yoda said. "Enough, perhaps. For now." "You've overstepped," Slymore murmured. "The guard will escort us to the Holonet studio," Bale said smoothly, "because we are going to tell the truth. Today, Moss. Not tomorrow. Not after you've manufactured a palatable version. Now." Yoda slid the second cylinder into the console. Holologs bloomed in the air above the desk. Recordings from concealed pickups within the Senate and from the Chancellor's own security network. In one of them, light boiled between 2 figures in the chamber below as the pods drifted like moons. The faces were small in the distant shot, but not small enough to hide what they were. In another, from days earlier, Mace Windu's purple blade shone near a window with sleeting rain beyond, and Palpatine's face twisted as lightning erupted from his hands. In a third, Palpatine leaned over a concealed transmitter in the works, voice low and full of the false tenderness he reserved for apprentices. "Rise, Lord Vader," he said. Mas Amedda saw his future shrivel like something caught too close to a furnace. Slymore's hands folded in front of her, long fingers crossing delicately. The guard shifted, the tilt of half a dozen blasters lowering at once by the infinitesimal degree that means there will not be blood today after all. "Come," Yoda said gently. "All of us." They moved as a small procession through corridors that had been pressed smooth by decades of footsteps. News traveled ahead of them and arrived behind them in overlapping waves of rumor and scrambled comms. The Holonet studio on level 80 smelled of hot lamps and spilled CAF. A hollow-eyed producer gaped as Masameda swept in flanked by guard and a Jedi no one had expected to see again. "We need a live channel," Bale told her. "All frequencies. We're under a lockdown," she stammered. "Executive protocols." "Lifted," Yoda said, and the panel on the wall obligingly shed its red. Within minutes the lamps burned. The camera's eye stared. The galaxy had hungered for clarity and had been fed only the thin porridge of terror and repetition. Now the image cut to a small green figure standing between an Alderaanian statesman and the vice chair of the Senate, with the Chancellor's pallid advisor like a ghost in the background and the legendary guard caught awkwardly in the frame. "Citizens of the Republic," Bale began, and his voice carried the warm timbre of a hearth that had been tended in grief. "I am Bale Organa of Alderaan. With me is Master Yoda of the Jedi Council. With us are Vice Chair Masameda and Senior Advisor Sly Moore. We appear before you to tell you what we know, not what we fear." He spoke simply. They showed the recordings. They did not embellish. Yoda said only a handful of words, enough to name what had happened as accurately as naming could. Masameda, to his credit or doom, did not attempt to bluster a counter-narrative into existence under that light. He stood like a monument to bad choices and watched his Ordion of history slip its leash and run. By the time the feed cut, Coruscant buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. The emergency channels hissed with district-by-district arguments. Who commanded whom, whether to trust what one's own eyes had seen on the screen, what to do with the companies of white-armored men standing uncertain in their barracks like boys caught with pockets full of stones no one had ordered them to throw. Far away, on a black river world where the trees shone with their own ghost light, a trooper named Bly lowered his DC-15 with hands that would not stop shaking. On Kashyyyk, Wookiees lifted their muzzles and bellowed grief and joy together into rain that smelled sweet as leaves. Yoda swayed once and caught himself. Too much for a day, even for a long day in a long life. Bale's hand hovered at his elbow and did not touch. "We have little time," Yoda said. "An end to the war we must make. The codes to shut down the droid armies. Somewhere in the tangles of his secret work, there are." "His work's lab," Sly Moore said unexpectedly. "You will find what you need there." He kept redundancies, but he trusted his own hands. He did not share. Masameda shot her a look divided between gratitude and hatred. "You'll doom us all." "I have always been doomed," she said, and the faint line at the corner of her mouth deepened by a shade. Bale's brow furrowed. "Then we go now. I'll bring the speeder around. There's a maintenance line that runs under the works. We can pop up without crossing the whole district." As they moved again, Yoda's comlink chimed. A tiny sound, almost apologetic. He knew who it would be before he looked. "Obi-Wan," he said. "Master," Obi-Wan's voice answered. The line was stripped of any sound but his breath and the old tiredness Yoda knew too well. "I felt something. Sidious. Gone he is," Yoda said quietly. Ended. The line that bound him to the living. The silence on the other end was not empty. It filled with things that might one day become words he could bear to say. "Anakin," Obi-Wan said at last. "I found him on Mustafar. He did everything we feared. I tried, Master, I tried, but couldn't kill him. He fell. The heat and the ash, he was burning when I left him. Padme is here. She's alive for now, but she's in trouble. Comer droids are preparing surgery." Yoda's eyes closed. That keening inside him was neither victory nor defeat. It was the sound the Force makes when a single branch shatters under too much snow. "Come to Polis Massa," he said. "Go. Fast you must." There was a sound like a nod. "What have you done?" Obi-Wan asked after a heartbeat's worth of courage. "The clones. Sent a command we have. Many will obey. Many will not. Dangerous times these are. Hope fragile like spun glass." He stopped at the edge of an open shaft. Light pooled far below in the works. that underworld where Palpatine had walked with his face uncovered. An end to the droids we will try to make. The war's end will give shape to how the rest falls. May the Force be with you, Obi-Wan said. And with you, Yoda whispered. Bail's speeder dove toward the industrial canyon. The works rose around them like the ribs of a turned-over animal, girders sighing, furnaces pulsing orange in the artificial dusk. They slipped into a maintenance tunnel like a fish finding a hidden current and slid along it until a hatch gave onto a room with steel bones and a table whose surface was scarred with the lines of 1,000 dissections, of truth and of metal. Sly Moore's memory proved good. Behind a wall panel lay a secondary console keyed to a cylinder labeled in plain Orbesh. Confederacy override. Yoda's hands, small and certain, moved the code. This time there was no poetry. The signal carved through space and fell like a soft winter across far places. On Skako Minor, where the Techno-Union's crawlers wound through soot, on Cato Neimoidia with its arching bridges in high fog, on Selukami's hot earth. Droids paused. Optic sensors dimmed. Blaster arms lowered with a soft whine. Then the armies went still. Everywhere, as if a bell had been rung whose note included the entire galaxy. Silence took the place of marching feet. A medevac ship screamed up through Coruscant's heavy traffic with light stuttering. Bail checked his comm. Mon says she's bringing a small caucus together on level 41. Senators enough to form a quorum if we can hold them in one place for 10 minutes. Mas Amedda will try to adjourn the Senate indefinitely on pretext of security. If he succeeds, the vacuum will swallow us. Go, Yoda said. A speech you must make. True and plain, let it be. You'll be safe. Safe. The wrinkle at the corner of Yoda's eye deepened. Nowhere. But safer than the truth no lie is. Go. Bail hesitated. What will you do? Wait, Yoda said. And listen. And stand where I must. He watched the Alderaanian go, the man's cloak like a fall of night stitched with dignities. Sly Moore watched Yoda watching him. You think this can be unwound, she said. Not unwound, Yoda said. Rewoven. And who will weave? She asked. Your order? The temple's years are over. Yes, Yoda said simply. It felt like an admission uncovered by the wind and left on the steps of a house that had belonged to a family for generations. As we have been, and we must. Become, we will, what we should have been. Smaller. Wiser. A chorus. Not a choir. Sly Moore's pale eyes flicked toward the distant skyline. He believed that everything could be arranged, if one only had the patience. He was patient all his life. He did not think death would be the interruption you made of it. Ever wrong about what cannot be arranged? The Sith are, Yoda said. She tilted her head. What will become of me? What you choose, Yoda said. Stay. Testify. Run. Hide. Turn the blade on yourself, perhaps. Many doors. She sighed. He would have laughed to see me here, speaking to a creature he kept in stories told to frighten young aides. Yoda nodded as if at a weather report. He started for the hatch, then paused. Be careful, he said, of emptiness. It invites a filling. He lifted himself toward the light. In the corridors above, the day had ripened into a thing with edges. Mon Mothma's eyes, precise and unsparing, met Yoda's as if measuring what weight he could carry and whether she could count on it not to shift. We have the numbers for a provisional session, she told him, crisp as a bell. We can recall the Judiciary Committee and appoint an interim chancellor for a 6-month term under Senate oversight. Unanimity you do not need, Yoda said. Direction you do. As they prepared, the city altered around them. The Coruscant Guard recalibrated subtler than logic, adjusting positions to protect approaches that suddenly mattered more than others. Reporters ran like messengers from a burning castle, cameras on shoulders, cables trailing like roots ripped free of dark soil. In the Temple District, smoke no longer rose like a new mountain. The surviving younglings who had hidden in ducts and behind statues peered out with eyes burned too old. One of them, a boy with a scar like a small crescent near his ear, held the hand of a girl and did not let go. On Mustafar, heat bent the horizon into mirage. Wind moved ash in sighing sheets over black glass. The slope above the river of fire bore the marks of a struggle. Gashes melted smooth, a drift of half-slagged metal, footprints that ended abruptly and did not begin again. Down a little way a figure crawled, then collapsed, crawled, then collapsed, leaving skin where hands touched stone. A family of Mustafarians in heat suits found him by the stink and the sound. They exchanged gestures under the shielding of their helmets and dragged him from the place where death still breathed warm against the ground. In the pale light of Polis Massa, droids chirred, instruments drew lines, and Padme's eyelids fluttered like a bird's shadow on a pond. Her breath was shallow. Obi-Wan sat near, fingers loose on his knees, as if he held still by decision because any other path would lead him to break. The babies came into a room of white light and clean air, and even the droids hushed, for some silences are natural law. Twins, the medical droid said. Healthy. Padme opened her eyes. The pain in them changed color when she saw what he carried. I thought I would die before I could touch them, she whispered. You must live, Obi-Wan said, and the plea was plain. You must live, Padme. She tried a smile that had once lit the Senate like a lantern. You never give orders, Obi-Wan. I'm trying something new, he said, and the ghost of a smile passed over his own face, unrecognizable to him and yet his. She touched their faces. Small astonishments. She closed her eyes. Anakin, she said, and in the saying some door opened on a memory that hurt and soothed at once. There was good in him. Obi-Wan closed his own eyes. He saw a boy in a junkyard discovering kindness like a planet discovering sun. A young man laughing as he swung down from a speeder in a rainstorm. A friend with eyes full of 1,000 complicated loyalties. There was, he said. There was. Then keep them safe, Padme said. Keep them safe, Obi-Wan. Hide them from what remains. We will, he said. Bail arrived half a day later with his cloak still smelling faintly of studio lamps and of the dust of old rooms broken open to air. They drew a plan between breaths. A life for a girl on Alderaan where mountains made their own laws and music. A life for a boy in a desert where the sky made men small enough to listen. A grave for a woman who would not be buried. A funeral to satisfy a galaxy's appetite for stories with endings. Padme slept. She woke. She held them each again and did not argue when they were taken to different arms. For she had understood something that neither man could yet say. She slept once more. This time she did not stir for a little while. When she woke again, her breathing had found a steadier rhythm, and color had returned in the winter sunlight of her skin. The droids whirred in diagnostic confusion. Unexpected, one said. Vital signs stabilizing. Obi-Wan looked at Yoda across the bed with something like wonder on his face and something like terror, because life desired is terrible, too, for those who love it. Master! Yoda's fingers touched the metal side of the bed as one might touch the bark of a tree that had survived a storm. The Force chooses, he said, and sometimes we do not argue. They did not keep her from the funeral that followed. The barge drifted across the canal on Naboo, flowers heavy enough to sink a small boat. Her family wept in a way that made space around their grief for others to enter. Padme's hair shone dark, her hands folded. The child's charm Anakin had carved long ago lay on her breast. She did not move. She did not breathe. But those nearest her knew the trick of velvet and water and air. She went down into a vault that held no body, and later she rose from the shadow of her own stone to the shadow of trees, and then to a small house by a lake where the wind's song covered her own. On Coruscant, the Senate convened with voices hoarse and faces raw. Mas Amedda presided because something must be presided over, and because sin does not collapse along the same lines as defeat. Mon Mothma introduced the Provisional Oversight Act with her hands steady, and Bail spoke as if he had been practicing all his life for this specific hour. A quorum passed the act with numbers just enough to stand in a wind. A judiciary trio took oaths to investigate crimes of state with a fervor that would later leave the taste of iron in their mouths. The clone army received Senate orders rescinding hostile status against the Jedi, pending a full review of the inhibitor chip program. In the barracks, Medics fumbled with scalpels and scanners over the temples of men, who looked at ceilings and wondered what proportion of the last week had been themselves and what proportion had been a tiny piece of ice that hummed when authority spoke. Wilhuff Tarkin did not attend. He had more pressing concerns than sessional politics. Scarif's star charts lay luminous before him, listing coordinates no one else yet knew to care for. The tone of his memos shifted by degrees invisible to men who had only a day to live at a time. The shape of his ambition did not alter, only its clothing. He found the gauge of the new wind and began, shrewdly, to sail in it. It would be some time before anyone realized how vexingly well some men adapt to a world where tyrants die and the taste for tyranny lingers. Yoda returned to the temple when the fires had cooled enough not to crack stone with their hunger. He walked through a forest of columns that had watched him grow tired and had never intervened. The smell was ash and oil and the thin bitter stink of burned insulation. Relief crews moved like white insects in the high spaces, and the echo of their voices kept the ghosts away, or at least at the edges. He stood where a statue had fallen and laid his palm on its broken hand as though he apologized. He went to the council chamber and sat in the place he had sat in for so long that the cushion had learned the shape of him. He closed his eyes and listened, not to determine what the Force wanted, but to ask it how it felt. Qui-Gon sat with him on the other chair, invisible and not. "You were brave," the voice said. "Brave," Yoda said without irritation. "Did what had to be done, I did. Brave is for the young. It's for anyone who enters the river," said Qui-Gon. Yoda opened his eyes and looked out over the empty seats of the little round room, at the sky beyond, at Coruscant's endless city stretching like a thought that had become too proud to be questioned. "The Order is not what it was," he said. "It does not need to be," Qui-Gon said gently. "It needs to be what it must become. Let go of what is not necessary. Keep what is. Teach them to listen first. Then teach them to speak. Blind, for too long we were," Yoda said, "afraid of shadows while standing in light too bright to see. The light is a teacher," the dead master said, "and the shadows too." In the med bays, clones went under sedation with hands that did not shake, though fear lived behind their ribs. Surgeons slid instruments into skulls with care and anger and shame. The chips came out like little glass teeth. Men woke with tears on their faces because there is a kind of pain the body recognizes as the absence of someone who was never truly there. Cody sat on a cot with his helmet in his lap and stared at the red chevrons on it, as if they were letters in a language he had once known and had forgotten. "General Kenobi," he said, throat rough. "Aye, sir, aye." Obi-Wan sat beside him. "We were soldiers together," he said. "Let's begin there." Rex, elsewhere, held the weight of a different history with a Jedi who had left the Order of her own choosing, and in doing so had become a compass that still pointed true. He thought of Ahsoka and of a night under a star-killing sky when ships went down like rain, and he looked at the hands that had tried to kill her. "No more," he told them, though the hands were his. "No more." On Mustafar, the man the galaxy would have known as Vader lay beneath a canopy of filters in a room cut into cool stone beneath a factory. The Mustafarian family had handed him over to a medical practitioner whose practice had once served miners with burns and lungs that ticked like machines. They did what they could. There were no miracles. What lived did so by virtue of a will too stubborn to permit its own absence. From time to time the man surfaced into blinks of waking and saw nothing, because pain stands between the eye and the world like a wall. Once he tried to speak and made a sound like a tool chattering against metal. The practitioner patted his shoulder and told him a story about a river that learned how to run uphill. Night on Coruscant made a cheap pearl of the planet. The city burned with its own stars, and ships drew thin lines like needles pulling thread. In a room whose windows looked over the traffic lanes, Yoda sat at a low table with an empty cup where tea had been. In its reflection on the tabletop's gloss, he saw the ghost of a scalp with a fringe of white hair and ears like large leaves. He laughed softly at himself. A soft knock came. It was not Masa Meta, for all his sins. That man at least knew the courtesy of form. It was not Sly Moore. She had chosen the door that led toward testimony. It was not Bale, who would have simply walked in with apologies, nor Mon, who would have come with a datapad and a request dressed as a question dressed as a moral imperative. It was a boy no longer a boy. Obi-Wan stood in the dim, a man both sharpened and rounded by a week that had devoured years. He bowed his head. "Master." "Sit," Yoda said. "Tea, if there was, I would share." "I didn't come for tea," Obi-Wan said. And then, realizing how that sounded, smiled a small grin he had not had to practice. "Though if there were, I wouldn't say no." They sat. Silence rolled between them, generous and unurgent. "I'm leaving Coruscant," Obi-Wan said at last. "I'll see the boy to Tatooine. The girl will go with Bail and Breha. Padme is alive, but lost to us except as a secret. She understands. She asked that it be so." Yoda nodded. "Hard paths the easy choices make, and easy the hard choices make for the future." Obi-Wan drew in a breath that steadied him. "What will you do?" "Change," Yoda said simply. "A place of noise the temple has been. Make of it a place of listening. We will gather those who remain. Send them out again, not as generals, but as gardeners." "Gardeners." "Hands in the soil," Yoda said. "Ears to the wind. Patience." He looked out at the endless city. "The Sith are not gone. Would be foolish to believe. Like weeds they are, like rot. But rot feeds trees when it is turned. Find the balance. Our task remains." Obi-Wan's mouth tilted. "Do you think the Chosen won?" He didn't finish, because to finish would be to ask a question that had broken the Order's back. "Misread. The prophecy was," Yoda said, not unkindly. "Or half-read. Balance is not a victory. It is a posture." "Anakin," Obi-Wan whispered. "Lives," Yoda said. "Senses it, I do." Obi-Wan's head jerked up. "Where?" "Where he has to," Yoda said. "In the ash of himself. Leave him there we must." Obi-Wan bowed his head. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he said, and the honesty was clean and a little raw. "Ask not of yourself things that are not yet ripe," Yoda said. "Forgiveness is a fruit, bitter when green." They rose together. Obi-Wan touched Yoda's shoulder. It was not the gesture of master and student, but of two men who had become peers by surviving the same storm in different boats. "Goodbye," he said. "Good journey," Yoda said. In the months that followed, the Republic did not heal so much as it learned new scars and learned to live with them. Courts sat. Trials were conducted for those who had profited from the long treason. Some were found guilty and sent away to planets whose names are made of numbers. Some were not, because the law is not a mirror but a set of tools, and some hands are cunning. The clones recovered more quickly than men who had never had names beyond the numbers printed in records expected. Many took new names. Some returned to the old numbers, finding in them a history they chose to claim instead of flee. A division of the army became a corps of aid, built to repair what had been broken. When the army had been taught to break. By its third season, it was said in the Outer Rim that if you needed a bridge you could do worse than to ask men in white armor with blue stripes to build you one. The Jedi ended. The Jedi began. The temple's great doors remained open, but the rooms once used for strategy and war games filled with quiet, and the gardens became classrooms where masters sat with a handful of students at a time and asked them to describe the wind without moving their lips. They learned languages that had no words. They tended small plants. They listened to music and said what colors it smelled like. They went out among the people and returned with dust on their boots and stories in their mouths and no shame. Ahsoka came and went, a bright streak, teaching without taking the title and refusing to be other than herself. Cal Kestis sent a message from the far end of a freight line. Safe. Ezra Bridger was not yet born to the trouble of the world, but was already written in its handwriting. The future relaxed its fists one finger at a time. On Mustafar, the man woke to less pain than before and to the realization that this was not the same as waking to no pain at all. He turned his head. The room blurred. Filters hummed. The practitioner looked at him with the air of someone waiting to be convinced to keep trying. "You live," the practitioner said in a language half clicks and half old basic. "You are not a minor." The man tried to speak again. This time the sound made a word.
No.
Then you are mech'd, the practitioner said.
Fallen.
That is bad luck. It can be changed. The man closed his eyes. Inside them, 2 babies breathed. He shook his head. No, he said again, and the word now was not about his identity but about the story that had brought him here. The word meant, there will be no more of that. Then what will you be? The practitioner asked, without malice. The man lay with the question like a stone under his tongue. He let it sit there for days. When he could stand, his legs trembled as if they belonged to a different man. When he could walk, he went only as far as the door and back, as if he were practicing with the idea. One night he stepped out into air that could kill. He returned into the filters and smoked light and decided that, for now, he was a man who could not live without assistance and who would try anyway. He built, with clumsy hands, a small box. The practitioner thought it was a game. The man thought it was a confession. Inside the box he put a component that hummed when powered. He turned it on and listened to the note. It wavered and then steadied. He turned it off and opened it and moved the component and turned it on again. He did this for hours, then days, then weeks, learning the difference between resonance and noise. A ship came and he felt it before instruments read it, in the way a pressure at the base of the skull can announce weather. He hid because he had learned that men come in ships to take things that cannot be returned. The ship left. He took his box and went deeper into the rock. He slept. He woke. He began to walk further, practice stretching out like a ribbon unrolled. One morning, he looked at his hands and did not recognize them as instruments of any particular god. He recognized them as hands. The startling ordinariness of them broke something in him that had needed breaking. He made tea with muck that might once have been called leaves on a world that had known rain. He drank. He coughed. He laughed into the coughing and heard a sound that belonged to no one else. On Coruscant, rain. It ran in threads down the temple's clean stone and made the gardens smell of a summer that belonged to no particular planet. Yoda sat beneath an overhang watching younglings press their palms to the wet paving stones to feel the cold. He felt Qui-Gon beside him like an old shawl pulled over shoulders. "Do you regret it?" the dead master asked. "Regret," Yoda said. He thought about the word, its shape in the mouth and how it tasted when you held it there a while. Regret that later came, always there is. That earlier came, seldom. Would change what I did? No. Would change what led to it? Yes. But slow that work is. Not for lightsabers. For hands. Qui-Gon laughed softly. "You sound like a gardener." "So I am," Yoda said. "So we must be." In a high office, Mon Mothma drafted the charter of a committee on reconstruction whose mandate would outlast the thrill of news cycles. Bail Organa wrote letters to a girl in another room of the same house and sealed them in a box to be opened when she could read. A Jedi with a beard touched down on a desert world and looked at the horizon with a heartbreak that had become a compass and a kind of grace. A woman with eyes like deep water held twins in memory and sometimes in arms and understood the difference. A man on a lava world learned how to carry a cup without spilling. A vice chair of a senate sat in a room that had belonged to a dead man and realized that presiding is not the same as ruling. An advisor with a bald head and a pale smile spoke, and in speaking shed a snake's skin. A soldier took off his helmet and felt the breeze on his damp hair and thought it was a miracle. A boy in a temple garden put his ear to a stone and heard it talk about the rain. The galaxy, burned, battered, deceitful, brave, foolish, went on as it always does when given half a chance, turning its wounds into history because that is what time does to pain when people keep waking up. One evening, as the light went the color of old honey over Coruscant's endless roofs, Yoda climbed, carefully and with a little complaint in his knees, to the upper terrace where once he had watched ships rise and had thought only of strategy. He watched now and did not plan. He listened, and in listening learned again what he had learned at last in the Senate chamber. That the Force is not a weapon to be held but a song one learns to hum in tune with. He hummed very softly. Lights came on like jutting stars all over the city. Somewhere out there, in a room without windows, a man put a component in a box and listened until the note steadied, and chose to leave it there. "Balance," Yoda said, trying the word the way one tries a new step on an old path. "A posture." An insect droned past. A child laughed below. Qui-Gon stood with him, quiet as ever. The night took their silhouettes and made them part of its grammar. In the morning, work would return. Trials and speeches, med programs, training schedules, the long business of unlearning. But for now, there was only the roof, the city, the weather, the smallness that is the beginning of wisdom, and the echo in his bones of lightning swallowed and transformed, a storm taken in and let go. He folded his hands over the edge of the parapet, and the old stones did not mind the weight. He breathed in, he breathed out, and below Coruscant breathed too. Morning made the temple's stone look almost like skin, warm in places where the light struck and spare where shadow still lived. Yoda woke before dawn as he always had, with the sense that the day was a beast that would be gentler if it were met early. He climbed the inner stairs slowly, joints singing little songs of protest, and came onto the high terrace as the first freighters stitched gleaming threads through the air. The city smelled faintly of rain and repulsors. For a long time he stood with his hands tucked into his sleeves and did nothing but listen, the way a physician listens to a chest and tells whether a cough is old or merely passing. Below, the temple gardens held dew in cupped leaves. The younglings who had been found in vent shafts and archives the night of the fire were sleeping in a quiet dormitory that had once been used for initiates on retreat. Their breath rose together like the tide. A handful of knights had returned in ones and twos, drawn by the message Bail had forced through the holonet and by something more intimate, the way grief goes home to ground when it is done running. Quinlan Voss arrived in a transport that smelled of spice and dust and shrugged his coat off as if he were setting down a story he'd been telling himself too long. Tara Sinub shuffled through the halls with a smile that made sorrow pause at the threshold. Jocasta Nu's absence felt like a missing note in a familiar scale. Shakti did not come. Whether the end had taken her on Coruscant or elsewhere, the Force kept her secret, and Yoda did not pry. Qui-Gon sat with him as the light strengthened, not outside him but beside him, as real as a hand on a shoulder and as unreal as a remembered taste. "You will be tempted to hurry," the old voice said. "The city looks like a wound. The galaxy looks like a wound. Wounds want cleaning. Sometimes they want patience more." "Patience?" Yoda murmured, and let the word roll in his mouth like a pebble made smooth by riverbanks. So much to mend. So much to unlearn. He went down when the day had the right weight. He went to a small room near the gardens where a circle of children sat with their backs straight and their hands on their knees, doing their best to look like stones. They turned their heads in unison as he entered, the way flowers turn to light. A boy in the front row wore a bandage like the crescent moon near his ear. A girl's braid was ragged where it had been cut with a blade too hurried for neatness. "Master," one whispered. Yoda said, and sat with them, folding himself small. "Listen first we do, then speak later." He closed his eyes, and the room learned a new quiet. In the Senate, voices learned the rough music of governance without an emperor to conduct. They were hoarse from the effort. Masa Meta presided in the daylight because daylight was a habit of power he could not shed. He had agreed to everything and nothing. He read out the roll when asked and banged the gavel when required and did not look at Sly Moore, who sat behind the witness desk with her hands folded, the pale of her skin a rebuke and a relief. Mon Mothma spoke with sharp precision about oversight, checks, the little mechanical words that keep large things from breaking again. Bail answered questions with the patience of a man who does not forget names. A provisional oversight committee took shape, an organism made of ambition and duty, and its first act was not righteous spectacle but the mundane power of requesting documents from Kamino. The message to Tapoka City went out on secure channels. Lama Su answered with the grace of a window being opened by a servant in a house it does not belong to. "We are a medical facility," the Prime Minister wrote, as if that sentence were an alibi. "We are happy to receive a Senate delegation to demonstrate compliance with all relevant statutes." Bail read the letter with his mouth corked in a tired little line. "We'll go in 3 days," he said to Yoda, to the small gathering in a Senate office that had been used for gossip and now smelled of something like work. "Medical review teams, legal counsel, and someone the clones will look at and see a person, not a badge." "Ahsoka," Rex said from the doorway, as if he had only just decided to have arrived precisely then. He stood in the threshold with his helmet under his arm and the blue stripes of the 501st still bright on armor he had scrubbed by hand. The scar near his right temple was not surgical, yet. His eyes went at once to Yoda, then to Mon, then back to Yoda with the particular soldier's flicker that gathers orders out of air. "Ahsoka will do what Ahsoka will do," Yoda said, not unkindly. "Ask her, you must." He looked at Rex a moment longer. "And you? Ready are you for this?" Rex's mouth thinned and softened in the same breath. "I don't know if I'm ready for anything," he said. "But I'm standing here." "Enough," Yoda said softly. A transport with no insignia lifted from Coruscant 2 days later with a compliment that looked like the beginning of a joke. A senator, a general without a rank anymore, 2 lawyers, an Umbaran whose presence made aides whisper, and a clone captain who insisted on carrying his own bag. Kamino received them with rain so fine it was almost a feeling rather than a weather. The landing pad stretched into mist. White structures rose like bones from a white sea. Inside the prime medical wing, the lights were gentle because the eyes they served had been grown to see only particular comforts. Nala Se stood with her long fingers steepled and her voice pitched in a register that was meant to reassure and did not. She spoke about production batches and efficiencies and the legal clarity of contracts. "The inhibitor protocols were designed to ensure cohesion," she said. "All militaries require cohesion. Your codes are precise. We met them precisely. The clauses that cite contingent executive orders were not written by the Senate," Mon said, crisp as frost. "They were inserted by Executive Office Council without review. Show us the implant specification." Nala Se gestured, and a hollow bloom of brain anatomy unfolded above a table. It was clinical, clean. The chip sparkled as a polite oval near the hippocampal region, exactly where one would place a thought and expect it to be remembered. Ahsoka arrived without fanfare midway through the demonstration, slipping between white-robed technicians with the unself-conscious grace of someone who had decided the path and then taken it. Rex did not turn. He felt her. She stood beside him. "Hey," she said softly. He took in breath like a man surfacing. "Hey, you're brave to be here." "I'm tired of being brave," he said then, because that was too close to the truth, smiled lopsided at her. "Good to see you, Commander." "I'm not a commander," she said. "Maybe I'm not a captain," he answered. They watched a Kaminoan technician bring a clone trooper, CT-7829, by the readout into the operating room. The man lay down without fear because he had been taught not to be afraid of procedures. Rex's hands flexed around nothing. "Consent forms," Mon said. "Signed by the individual. Clear, unambiguous. No blanket authorizations. We are happy to comply," Lama Su said from a dais, as if he were still in control of the mathematics of the place. "We wish for nothing but transparency." "Nothing but transparency," Sly Moore repeated quietly, and the corner of her mouth deepened again by that same shade that might have been irony and might have been the last of her practiced restraint dissolving. They watched the removal. They watched the chip float in sterile solution like a bit of frozen rain. They watched CT-7829 wake with tears sliding into his ears. "Sir?" he asked the white light in the ceiling. Rex stepped forward. "At ease," he said softly. "You're safe. You're going to be all right." The Kaminoan surgeon angled his head. "His recovery will be excellent," he said. "Our work is precise." Mon's eyes did not leave the trooper's face. "Your work," she said, "does not get to decide what excellent means." By evening a line had formed along the corridor outside the surgical bays. Men with numbers who had begun to say their names aloud to one another in the waiting moments as if names were talismans. Some carried helmets under their arms. Some had nothing in their hands and looked unsure what to do with that emptiness. Ahsoka walked along the line and stopped at each man and touched forearm to forearm in the old salute that had never been regulation and had always been law. On a desert world that smelled of dust and iron and the faint sweetness of old water, a robed figure led a small Eopie along a ridge and watched a farm below where a man and a woman moved in the stubborn choreography of work. Owen Lars glanced up once, A flick of suspicion asked and answered, and went back to his hydra wrenches. Baru stepped into the doorway with a cloth over one shoulder and looked toward the horizon like a person trying to memorize the shape of weather. Obi-Wan stood on the lip of the homestead like a line cut into stone. He had said it all in the days before, the measured apologies that were not apologies, the explanations that could not carry all their weight, the promises that were not promises but vows to the dead and to the living both. Ben, Baru had said, tasting the name like a fruit that might be sour and might be sweet. I can call you Ben. Please, he had said, and her kindness had nearly undone him. He did not go inside. He placed the bundle in Baru's arms with a care that was both ordinary and holy. He looked not at Owen, who had already turned toward the day, but at the child whose mouth made a small astonished O at the feel of air. The boy's eyes were closed, lashes dark against skin so pale it held the light. Luke, Obi-Wan whispered, and the name sat in the air like a chord that would not resolve for many years. He bowed his head and stepped back and faded into the sun's glare like a ghost choosing to stay. In the Dune Sea he built a hermit's life out of moisture and patience. He bartered with Jawas for circuit boards and for stories. They gave him both in equal parts and were only slightly offended when he paid more for the stories. He learned who to avoid in Mos Eisley by the way the cantina door opened on certain afternoons. He learned the sound of Tuscan songs carried on wind that had sand in it. Once, when a tribe's path intersected a moisture farmer's need, he stood at a distance with his hands open and spoke without words until the stampede of fear slowed and turned. He did not carry his lightsaber in his hand again. He carried it at his belt like a duty asleep. At night he sat in his hut and let the desert's huge quiet peel the day's noise from him. He kept his back straight and his breath even and did not try to make anything happen. At first he heard only himself, the old echo of grief, the fresh grit of self-reproach, the sudden knife of a memory with no warning. Then once the quiet changed temperature, and another quiet slipped into it, the way a cloud slips over a moon without breaking it. Obi-Wan, said a voice full of patient surprise, as though it had expected to find him here all along. He laughed then, helplessly and softly, because he had not laughed in a way that belonged to him since the younglings used to hide his stylus in the council chamber and pretend innocence until their shoulders shook. Master, he said, we will practice, Qui-Gon told him, and practice is a kind of love. In the lake country of Naboo, a small house kept its shutters closed and its path swept. The woman who lived within wore her hair simply and carried baskets that looked heavier than they were. Padme moved through rooms that remembered laughter and did not insist on it. Sabe came at odd hours dressed as whoever would draw least attention. She brought one day a tiny hollow projector with the smell of Alderaan still on it and set it on the little table by the window. A message, she said simply, from an old friend. Padme sat very straight in the chair. The hollow bloomed. It was Bael's face and Breha's shoulder beside him and a parcel of blanket that breathed. Leia's mouth pursed in sleep. The recording had been made quickly, without art, because the moment itself was sufficient art. Bael spoke only her name and said that the child thrived and that Breha sang to her a lullaby that belonged to mountains. The picture flickered and died before any sorrow could come into it. Padme's hands had been steady the whole time. After, she let her head drop and her hair fall like a curtain. Sabe knelt beside her and set her forehead against Padme's knee. You are the bravest woman I know, Sabe said into cloth. I am a woman who breathes, Padme answered finally, and I know what I chose. She wrote letters in the evenings when the wind smelled like water. She did not address them. She folded them and put them into a box. She wrote to a girl and to a boy and to a man she had loved in several incompatible ways at once. She wrote about the Senate and about the way sunlight looked on the lake in the last hour before dusk. She wrote about fear and about stubbornness and about how love is a decision one sometimes has to make again every day like putting on shoes. On Mustafar, the clinic when viewed from above looked like a breath held in stone. The practitioner who had taken the mect had done so out of habit and pity and a sense that one does not refuse a job simply because it looks impossible. He did not ask the man for his name again. He had heard the answer and found it sufficient. He fashioned prosthetics out of what he had. Mining braces, exosleeves, a clever hinge that a boy had brought him in exchange for a promise to fix his mother's cough. He learned the shape of the man's ruined limb tracks the way a shipwright learns the lines of a hull. The man practiced walking in a corridor that smelled of heat and sterilizing agents. He fell often. He learned to stand quickly without cursing. He learned to hold a cup with the mechanical hand that had once been stronger than his patience. He learned the limits of his strength like borders on a map drawn as he traveled. When he slept, he dreamed of edges. He dreamed of the way the red flow had illuminated particles in the air and made them look like galaxies. He dreamed of hands he had held out of love and hands he had raised out of rage, and how sometimes they had been the same hands. He woke with his jaw clenched and his chest a stone. He sat up and listened to the clinic hum until the hum gentled him. Then he stood with the box he had made and moved the component by a millimeter and switched it on again. He would get it right. A ship came again. This time it did not pass. Cut its engines with a scavenger's caution. Shapes moved in the heat shimmer. The practitioner muttered a string of clicks that meant bad luck. Guests, blades. The man with the mechanical hand reached for the tool that had been a weapon and then set it down again, very slowly, as one refuses a thought. He went to the door and watched. Geonosians flowed out of the ship like insects erupting from a wound. One of them wore a harness with black plating engineered for Mustafar's gravity and heat. His eyes glittered under the lens protectors. He carried a tool the shape of a spear that hummed near the tip. The buzzing of his wings subsided as he addressed his crew. The practitioner translated softly. They found the factory in the valley. They will wake it. They will call the army to rise. The man closed his eyes briefly. The Confederacy's leaders lay dead on a world not far in memory. He had done much of that himself. But the networks beneath them, the programming that turned bolts into feet and feet into marches, still slept in molten caves. Palpatine had intended to have every lever. Palpatine was dead. In such vacuums, lesser men and old programs came alive. He felt the old hunger coil in him, that quick, simple answer of violence. He did not trust himself with it. He turned his mind the way a pilot yaws a damaged ship into atmosphere and prays the angle is right. "Where is the factory?" he asked. The practitioner pointed with his chin. "Below the river bend. Heat enough to hide it." "I will go," the man said. "You cannot," the practitioner answered without judgment. "But you will." He went at dusk, when the light drew long shadows that could hold a man. He used the paths the miners used when they needed to get home without being seen by supervisors who measured minutes in wages. He did not draw on the Force on purpose. It moved in him regardless, because it is not a tool that stops being itself when a hand refuses to hold it. He reached the access vents of the factory and listened to the air. He felt the tremor that means awakened machines. Inside, the heat was a hammer. Conveyor systems shuddered. A line of B-1 units lay in neat supine order waiting for first instructions like infants whose first breath will be a number. The Geonosian with the plated harness moved along a catwalk checking welds. The man watched the path of the power distribution and his mouth made a small shape, recognition, not joy. All his life had been machines bound to life. He knew where to cut. He did not raise a blade. He walked the outer ring while the crew inside finished their calibrations and found the junction that handled both external intake and internal redistribution, an efficient stupidity. He knelt. He slid the panel free with a patient technique that would not throw sparks. He took out 2 lengths of wire and laid them across like a child making a letter. He closed the panel and moved. When the foreman threw the switch, the plant took in a great breath. The breath caught. The air hummed and then stuttered and then reversed along a shorted path. The first row of B-1s sat up and then lay down again with a cheerful chirp none of them had been programmed to release. The catwalk lights flickered. The Geonosian foreman hissed orders that had served him in 100 hives and served him now not at all. The man let himself feel the force just enough to jump a gap between 2 support ribs without falling. He reached the control mezzanine just as the alarms found their rhythm. He did not kill the Geonosian who met him there because he recognized the small choice that had become large in his life. He walked past him like a wind. He turned two valves that had not been touched in a generation. The molten river sang. The factory choked on its own breath and then went quiet in stages, like an animal that does not know it has been cut until the blood reaches the floor. He stood in the silence and shook. Then he laughed once, a single bark that startled him. He sounded like someone else and also like himself. Outside, the Geonosians retreated with a professional's lack of drama. They would find another facility. They would try another day. The practitioner found the man where the rocks were hot and sat beside him with a canteen. "You did not kill," the practitioner observed, with no praise and no censure. "It would have been easy," the man said. "Yes." They sat together and watched the day finish its last tasks, which on Mustafar are to burn and then to soften into something like evening. Later the man went back to the clinic and moved the component inside his box by half a finger's width and turned it on again. The note steadied quicker this time. On Coruscant, trials began like seeds planted in rows. Slow, the harvest uncertain, but a new habit nonetheless. Sly Moore told the Judiciary Committee where to look for accounts and for signatures written by proxies and for the kind of shame that hides in clause language. She did not cry. Masa Meta sat and said what he knew he had to say, which was not all that he could have said. Some senators prostrated themselves to the new wind with a grace that bespoke practice, which is another word for cowardice in silk. Others stood like small trees that had been mocking the forest fire for its drama and were now bewildered by the rain. Tarkin's memos continued to go out, dry as old bread and useful as timber. He championed the demobilization of the most expensive parts of the fleet on grounds of fiscal prudence while quietly securing appropriations for something he labeled the Outer Systems Stabilization Initiative. Its home station would be on a tropical world no one cared about yet. Scarif learned the shape of interesting scaffolds. The clones came and went from the temple as patients and as something else. Men who had worn armor and now wore uncertainty like a new uniform. Some wept in the gardens where no one needed to see. Some asked to stay and were given brooms and spades and classes on listening. And to their own surprise they found that listening was as hard as shooting had been and as satisfying when one got it right. Rex stood in a doorway on an afternoon when the rain had made the flagstones slick and watched Ahsoka sitting cross-legged with a child who had lost everything but the ability to ask questions. He loved her in a way that did not ask anything from the loving and set that love down like a tool polished by being used. "Fulcrum," he said softly when she came to him later in the armory, where weapons had been turned into exhibits for a lesson titled History of Tools. "I'm not building that," she said and smiled because she knew he was not talking about a code name but about a purpose. "I'll go where I'm needed. That's all. Right now, I'm needed here." "Right now," he agreed. Quinlan Voss slipped out of the temple as casually as he had slipped in. He left with a list written in his head of worlds where the last days of the war had left debts to be paid in medicine and jokes. Tara Sinub stayed and taught the young ones how to walk in a crowded room without touching anyone and how to notice small crimes before they became large tragedies. The council chamber remained empty on purpose, its chairs unfilled as a way of making the air less arrogant. Padme took to walking at night, when the breeze off the lake carried the voices of insects, which are the galaxy's truest aristocrats. She wore a simple cloak and a hood despite the weather. She carried nothing but her keys and the fact of herself. She did not speak to anyone beyond Sabe and a fisherman who called her by a name that was not hers and never asked her for another. She listened to Naboo's quiet, which was shaped not like Coruscant's long hum but like breath drawn and released in sleep. She dreamed sometimes that she stood in the Senate and said all the words she had not said when power was a game of decorum. In the dream, the pods were empty and also full of the faces of people she had actually known. She explained to them what it means to be loyal without being blind. She reminded them of the first rule of service, which is to place the good where it can grow. In the dream, they listened. When she woke, she had enough of that listening in her bones to get through the day. Obi-Wan walked the dune sea at dawn, when the light made the sand into an ocean of small mirrors. He let the Force show him tiny things. The tracks of a womp rat, the way a moisture collector's read outside rather than ticked when it needed a new filter, the way Owen's posture changed when he was biting back gratitude he would not say. He did not approach the homestead often, but when he did, He left a coil of wire or a sack of seed near the door, and Baru always found it and never asked from where. He watched the boy once, crawling in the courtyard, hands open, mouth damp with some kind of astonishment that no one had invented a word for yet. He put his hand on the wall and felt heat and the slow turn of a future that did not need him to push. Qui-Gon's lessons were not instructions so much as companionship. The dead master showed him how to shape his breath into a bowl and to set his questions into it like water. He showed him how to hear the wind of a voice that did not come from the ear. He showed him the humility of being surprised by wisdom when it arrives like a dusty traveler who asks for a drink and then leaves without a speech. "They think you're a myth," Obi-Wan murmured into the quiet once. "Good," said Qui-Gon, amused. "Myths ask less of the living." On Kamino, Lama Su stood at the high window and watched the ships come and go. The audits continued. The forms multiplied. The Senate's lawyers found their muscles. For the first time in his life, the Prime Minister wondered if he had been a very small piece on a board too large for his dignity. He did not confess this to anyone. He adjusted a cuff. He smiled when the delegation left. He sent a message to a list of clients whose names were not part of the public contracts. In a hangar on Coruscant, a grizzled clone removed his helmet and held it like a skull. "Name's Kix," he said to the medic with the clipboard who had expected a number. "You want to build a medical corps out of us? I'll help you build one that doesn't forget we're people when we're patients." Mon Mothma looked up from a table covered in pleas for funds and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand because sometimes tiredness comes out that way. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not sure yet who will fight me harder, the people who want to forget the war or the ones who want to keep it because they know how to live in it." "We'll be here when your fights end," Kix said. "People still get sick." On Moraband, dust held the memory of screams the way sandstone holds fossils. Yoda stood at the entrance to a tomb and did not go in. He let the wind curl the edges of his robe and inhaled air that smelled as old as fear. He felt the whispering of a hunger that insists there is only it and nothing else. He neither hated it nor loved it. He regarded it as one regards a canyon. Real, dangerous, worth circumnavigating rather than pretending away. He pressed his palm to the weathered about this. He lowered the metal. "Maybe it's a shovel," he said uncertainly, because he had not yet learned that shovels are nobler than swords. "Maybe," Yoda agreed and put his hand on the earth. "Try." In the Senate that afternoon, Mon Mothma lost a vote she had thought she would win. She went to Bale's office and put her head on his desk for exactly 5 seconds, then sat up, smoothed her hair, and began again to count noses. "It will not be 1 season or 2, she said when he pushed a cup of tea toward her and the steam made her eyes sting. "It will be years." "Good," he said. "We will have time to make fewer mistakes." Slymore stood in a small empty room and looked at her hands. She had always known where to put them. Behind her back on a file, laced so the knuckles made a neat line. Now she set one over the other and felt their weight without a choreograph. She went to Masameda with a folder not as a supplicant but as a citizen and offered to continue testifying. He looked at her like a man measuring whether a bridge would hold and nodded once. They would never be friends. They would be 2 people standing near the same crime scene remembering different angles. Ahsoka left Coruscant with Rex 2 months later with no plan beyond the first 3 days. They went to a farming moon because someone had asked and because it is difficult to leave a message unanswered when you have seen the face of the person who left it. On Rada they found fields burned not by war but by neglect, and they found a boy who could fix anything except the feeling he was useless. They found work for their hands and for their hearing. At night Ahsoka sat with her back against a silo and looked at the stars and did not call herself anything. Rex slept with his helmet near his hand and woke more often than he slept and began to dream of building instead of dying. They stayed as long as they were useful, which is the most honest measure of time. On Tatooine, a child took a first step, then a second, and laughed like the sound water makes when a dam is lifted. Obi-Wan stood at the ridge and laughed, too, aloud, alone, and let the wind carry the sound so it could come back to him changed. He wrote in the sand with his finger the ancient kata his master had taught him, and then wiped it away with the side of his hand because the past is not a relic but a teacher, and good teachers do not insist on being frame-hung. Yoda slept one afternoon, an old man's luxury, and dreamed he was planting beans with a small trowel. When he woke, he went to the kitchen and found a sack of seed someone had left after a class. He went to the garden and made a row and pressed beans into the damp earth. He did not use the force to make them grow faster because he had learned that shortcuts are cruelty disguised as kindness. News came from 100 places and did not change the pattern. Small kindnesses, small corruptions, the steady work of courts, an explosion in a shipyard that turned out to be fraud dressed up as sabotage, pirates who discovered to their bewilderment that it is more profitable to convoy grain than to steal it, scarif sprouted cranes, and those who cared about such things argued about whether cranes are harbingers. Moraband lay very still and very patient and counted nothing. Anakin, the man who did not call himself that to anyone who could repeat the word, sat in the cockpit of his ugly ship and watched a planet rise. He felt the tug toward it like a thread tied to his ribs. It was not the desert. It was not the mountain. It was a world with cities that had been afraid and had learned to be only wary. He thought of turning away as penance for wanting. He did not turn away. He set the ship on a small, unimportant course toward an unimportant landing bay and told himself that being unimportant was now his highest calling. He stepped into a street that smelled of frying oil and rain on warm stone and felt invisible for the first time in years. No one called his name. No one saluted. A child ran into him and apologized and did not look up. He walked until his legs told him to stop and then kept walking because he did not yet trust them to know what they were talking about. He found a stall with tea and sat on a low stool. He held the cup with his mechanical hand and felt the heat anyway. A holoscreen in the stall's corner showed a bridge and men in white armor handing planks to children. The vendor shook his head. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, and laughed without mockery. "The galaxy can still surprise me." "It always will," the man said, surprising himself. He went where he could do small repairs for small people. He adjusted intake valves for women whose shoulders had grooves from carrying water. He tightened a bolt on a playground swing that squeaked and frightened toddlers. He walked past a brawl and did not enter it. He walked past a man shouting at a girl and stood between them with his hands down until the man muttered and left, which is a kind of victory not credited on any wall. At night, he took apart his box and put it back together and put his ear to it like a person listening for a heartbeat. Sometimes the note wavered. Sometimes it did not. The days built themselves. Qui-Gon stood with Yoda on the terrace in the cool before dawn, and the old master pointed with his chin at the city's endless plains. "That one will love plains when he is small," Qui-Gon said, and Yoda smiled because he could hear the smile in the voice. "Love and plains, Yoda said. "Could be worse." "It will be, sometimes," the dead master said, and Yoda nodded, because truth is not a friend one argues with. It is the friend one eats with and invites back. He went inside. The day met him as it always did, with its arms full, with its patience, with its stubborn insistence that each choice matters and that the Force is not interested in spectacle so much as in whether the hand that puts the cup down does so gently. On Alderaan, Leia reached for a datapad with fists and smacked it like a drum. Breha laughed and tapped back. Bail walked in and watched his daughter invent instruments and thought, as men sometimes do when they have spent too much time in rooms where words are weapons, that rhythm is also politics. On Tatooine, Luke stood with his toes gripping sand. He looked at the horizon and did not know why it was calling his name. He laughed and spun and fell and got up and forgot the call because a bug flew by that had iridescent wings. Obi-Wan watched him and learned a new prayer he would never speak aloud. Let him be loved enough to be brave. On a nameless moon in a station with a cough for a name, a man sat on the floor with his back to the hull and thought of a lake and of hands and of light on a Senate desk and of a boy and a girl whose breaths he had felt as a kind of wind inside his chest. He did not reach for them in the Force because the Force belongs to all and does not come when it is summoned like an animal. It comes when it will. He closed his eyes and listened. Somewhere far away an old man planted beans. Somewhere closer a woman folded letters into a box and did not lock it. Somewhere a clone taught a class titled Field Surgery for Mud and Pride. Somewhere a ship fell apart in such a way that no one was harmed, which is a kind of miracle. He opened his eyes. He stood. He went to work. And the galaxy, which has never promised fairness and rarely offers peace, did what it always does when given half a chance. It made room not for victory without cost, but for mornings. Coruscant breathed. The temple stones remembered heat and accepted cool. The Senate gavel fell sometimes true and sometimes not, and sometimes was not needed at all. The desert learned the steps to the dance of a child chasing a lizard and found them pleasing. Yoda walked into the garden and checked the bean row. A green tip had pushed through. He smiled without being surprised. He looked at the younglings and lifted his chin, and they came and knelt and looked with him, and one said, "It's small," in a tone that held both disappointment and awe. Yoda said, "Like all true beginnings, small it is." He stood a little longer, then went inside to meet the day with his sleeves already rolled. The Force hummed lightly, an old song well remembered. Lightning that had once been a weapon now lived in bone as a story about what the small can do when they decide to be strong in the right way. And somewhere, in a cockpit, a note steadied and stayed.